Welcome to Atheists Talk. I'm your host, Grant Steves. In this program, we are going to be discussing a book about unreason in America. And my guest is Jack Caravela. Jack, I'd like you to introduce yourself and give some background about your qualifications in talking about this book.
Well, I've spent my career as a publishing professional. I've been an editor, acquiring both fiction and nonfiction for a large trade publishing house in New York, St. Martin's Press, not a religious publisher. I've also worked as a literary agent and even as a book designer and typesetter. So what I bring to this is hopefully a knowledge of books and some perspective on publishing.
Okay, thank you. The book that we are going to be discussing specifically is the new book by Susan Jacoby, The Age of American Unreason. Ms. Jacoby is specifically looking at how anti-intellectualism and anti-rationalism has affected at least the last 40 years. But in looking at the history of this with Jack in this program, I want to look at it in a greater perspective in terms of the history of the problems of anti-intellectualism and how it has become so much a part of the American landscape. In one of her opening points in the introduction, she says that in the last 4 decades, America's endemic anti-intellectual tendencies have been grievously exacerbated by a new species of semi-conscious anti-rationalism, feeding on and fed by ignorant pop culture of video images and unremitting noise. Well, that's the introduction to Ms. Jacoby. Let's get to the book, the review, and the history first. In terms of its strengths and weaknesses, that's what I'd like to talk about first. Mm-hmm. And I know that you had some things that you thought were really, really good, and there were things that you were somewhat questioning. So what about the strengths of the book first?
Well, I think, first of all, Susan Jacoby is a wonderful historian, and I'd recommend particularly her book, Freethinkers, which is a history of American secularism, which was the book she wrote before this one, mm-hmm. which is exclusively a history of free thought, of unconventional religious views, agnostics and atheists in America. And she does a very nice job of tracing that history. Some of it also appears in Freethinkers in her new book, The Age of American Unreason. And she's very good at that, going from all the way from the beginnings of the country up until the civil rights era of the 20th century and beyond. That makes for a very interesting reading. The other thing that I really admired about the book was her exploration of junk thought. And this goes beyond simply junk science, which we can get into later or maybe in the next program. But she explores the way junk thought is manifested, and also the techniques, the rhetoric that's used, and that I found very instructive. Made me think of that in new ways, and it helps you recognize it more when you encounter it. As far as weaknesses, I think a autobiographical section was less instructive to me when she relies on her personal experiences, particularly growing up in what she refers to as a quote-unquote middlebrow household, and kind of generalizes that to an American middlebrow. My problem with that was really that she doesn't really attempt to define middlebrow, highbrow, and lowbrow, particularly not lowbrow. I think she may have mentioned that once, mm-hmm. which I would imagine would be the largest segment of the American public. Mm-hmm. But she never really tells us how big a percentage each is, right. and doesn't really demonstrate to me anyway a legitimate case for the existence of a middlebrow segment of the American public and then its disappearance. I thought that was a little sketchy.
Is there any way of sort of getting at what she means by middlebrow? I know that she cites some specific things that middlebrow people do that highbrow wouldn't do.
And that was one of the problems because, for instance, highbrow, one little thing that I noted was that she mentioned classical music and opera as a highbrow preoccupation, and anyone who was born and raised in an Italian household, whether it's lowbrow or middlebrow, will know that opera crossed all those barriers, and I still don't see it as a highbrow form of entertainment. But that is the problem that you've mentioned. She mentions specific things that a middle-brow household would do, reading certain types of books and being exposed to certain kinds of culture, not in an extremely abstract, avant-garde way, which is what she would say the highbrows would do, but in a knowledgeable way and in a way that's interested in science and culture. So that really, in essence, is my problem with it. She doesn't really tell you what makes a middle-brow family middle-brow and distinguish it from low-brow, because she doesn't treat low-brow at all.
Right. It does seem to me that with middle-brow, for example, she mentions the Book of the Month Club, which became popular in the 50s, I think, and into the 60s. It still is out there selling books. But that it was a way of getting to people that didn't really have access to bookstores.
Right.
Because I remember being a member of the book club and my family, because you didn't have bookstores in the country. It was very hard, other than the library. That would be the only way that you could get your own copy of a book.
Right.
And so I guess I was in middlebrow. And it almost, she almost seems to imply that lowbrow are illiterate people, that they don't probably read at all.
Right, right.
And the highbrow, they only read the classics.
Or it may be, you see, it's not completely clear whether a lowbrow person or family would read only pop culture, what she would consider pop culture these days, bestsellers, genre fiction, and so forth. And those lines are kind of blurry too, because certain genre fiction with time gets elevated to a more respectable position.
Yes. Well, getting to another way of approaching this in terms of a book would be to look at her history of American thought, in a sense. And we start out with the educational system as she has a view of it, and I think that we have our own view of what the educational system happened to be, but how that developed from the time of the Revolution on up through to the present time. You had some comments about the educational system.
Yeah, I thought one thing that was very instructive is she points out education is not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. And it was a point that some of our founders were very insistent on, that there should be a national system of public education. Jefferson and Madison particularly, I believe Adams also supported that, but they never got that legislation passed. And it has had far-reaching effects because it relegated education to the local level and states' rights, and it really created kind of a patchwork. And also allowed religious instruction in public schools, since the schools were administrated by states rather than the federal government. So we might have a very different educational system. We certainly would if we had a national system with national standards from the beginning.
It also seemed that the northern states in particular had a much more of an impetus for public education, that they seem to be the group that developed things like the Lyceum series in the 1800s, and that they began to do the secondary education about the same time as the Lyceum, but that it was less so in the South, that they also seem to have much more of a religious influence in the South. And I thought it was kind of interesting that religion, in a sense, formed public education by the fact that there were so many different religious groups. They couldn't agree, therefore public education would have less religion in it.
Right, right. She even points out that it wasn't even a matter of completely different religions combating each other. It was just differences between Protestant denominations initially, even before Catholics came in, and I guess Jews were enough of a minority that they could be effectively ignored at that point. But that's where the secularism came from.
There was one person that you referred to who was a universalist, which would be related to the Unitarian and the deist group. And they were very upset because they were sending their children to a public school and they were getting Calvinist in teachings. So you began to have this split over, are we going to teach them the Trinity or are we going to teach them a deist approach to God? I thought the movement of the Lyceum was really fascinating to me, because we don't have an equivalent, in a sense, until I think in a present day where we have people that come around with books to the bookstores and they present it, that's sort of like the Lyceum, because Emerson was one of the great, Ralph Waldo Emerson was one of the great speakers at these, and he wasn't exactly a deeply religious man, was he?
No, in fact, he became less religious as time went on.
Yes.
But another person was Robert Ingersoll, who she mentions in Freethinkers and briefly in this book, known as the Great Agnostic, who would command very large groups of people, very large audiences to see him. And as she points out, in that day when the Lyceum was an important form of entertainment as well as information for people, they would go and see people whose opinions they did not necessarily agree with.
Right.
And that is something that seems to be falling away with mass media, and possibly because there are so many outlets that you can pick and choose the particular one that will be more in agreement with your own ideology.
I remember one of my professors talking about fighting Bob La Follette from Wisconsin, who was a senator. He would go, he was campaigning for president, and he appeared at the Iowa State Fair. This is the summer. Inside of a tent would have been probably at least 100 degrees or more. And he would speak for 4 hours. Number one, I don't know how his voice could stand it. Number two, I don't know how the audience could stand it. But at the end of 4 hours, they would clap and ask for more. That shows the rapid change in our culture within the last 100 years, because it's about 100 years ago that La Follette was out trying to gain office. Getting back to the development of the educational system, though, you had the Lyceum, you had the development of secondary education, and then there's the great Carnegie. And there are still Carnegie libraries in this city, certainly, and around the country. And that was also something that helped to push education. So there's a strong movement toward education, which is one of the contradictions which I find kind of amusing in our culture. That on the one hand, we want education. On the other hand, we are very suspicious.
Right.
And that anti-intellectualism comes up, doesn't it?
Right, and she points out that in the days of the one-room schoolhouse, one of the proudest achievements for a town would be the hiring of a school teacher. And then that's developed to this century and later 20th century, where teachers were held, if not in contempt, with much more suspicion, and the origin of the phrase, "those who can't do teach," is originated. So a very strange metamorphosis took place.
Yes, teachers have lost a little bit of the reputation, having come from that field myself. The separation issue is interesting in terms of its development. As I noted, the number of Protestant groups helped with the educational system, sort of compromised on what would be taught. Catholics continued to have their own educational system, really up through the 20th century, even to the late 20th century. And then you have the division between the groups. I remember my neighbors were Pentecostal. They had been Democrats for generations, I guess, and John Kennedy ran for president in 1960. They could not vote for a Catholic. They switched parties in 1960 and became Republican because of religion. And that's 48 years ago, that we still had that religious divide in this country, and it was strong enough that people would change political parties. And presumably we don't have that anymore. But that's for the 20th century when we start to deal more closely with that. There was another issue that I think is foundational and developmental at this point in time, and it came out of Darwin, but it wasn't from Darwin. And that is social Darwinism. And a lot of people think it was Charles Darwin who started this mess. And it wasn't, was it?
No, not at all. In fact, the term social Darwinism wasn't coined until 1944. It's a convenient way of naming this, which is a misuse of evolutionary theory. And it's interesting in that the so-called social Darwinists were not free thinkers or atheists necessarily. They were people who took a new development in science and twisted it to achieve their own ends. And in social Darwinism, the idea was to give a rationalization for the disparity between rich and poor, and basically to make tycoons and other very wealthy people feel that they were deserving of their wealth and good about themselves in general. And the mechanism doing this was to take evolution and interpret it very narrowly as tooth and claw survival of the fittest, and then assert that people were wealthy and prosperous because they were the fittest and deserving of it. And this would be very appealing to a certain segment of the population. One person, though, in fact, it turned out he became the president of Vanderbilt University. He was what you would call a social Darwinist, but interestingly enough, he used a twisted form of evolutionary theory for very racist policies. And one of his assumptions was that the white race was superior and was the most evolutionary advanced because we know that Adam was white. So he linked it directly to the Bible.
Right.
So not something that Darwin had in mind.
Well, and that was very common, the racism coming out of the Bible. That's one of the great untold stories, even in public education, of how racism is based on in Protestantism of the South in particular. But here you have social Darwinism. Was it Richard Hofstadter?
Yes, yeah, Richard Hofstadter coined the term, and he's referred to quite a bit in Susan Jacoby's book because he was the author of Anti-Intellectualism in America, I believe the title was, in 1963, which was, if not a blueprint, an inspiration for her book.
Right. Yeah. So we have this kind of background that is leading us to the present time, where you begin to have the roots of anti-intellectualism and anti-rationalism, because the founding fathers were really out of the age of enlightenment, which is the honor toward the intellectual. Right. And then we start to see this fragmenting, don't we? Were there certain influences in that very beginning that started toward pushing us toward anti-intellectualism?
Well, I think Hofstadter says that anti-intellectualism has kind of always been with us, and it runs in cycles. And it seems to me, this isn't taken directly from Hofstadter, it seems to wane in the face of scientific achievement and improvements, things that people cannot deny, like, for instance, Susan Jacoby mentions the Salk polio vaccine. That's such an obvious triumph of science that you can't refute that. And it was something that helped lead to more of an intellectual appreciation. But the founders, many of them were what Susan Jacoby calls correctly polymaths, people who were interested in many different disciplines. Right. And as you said, we're products of the Enlightenment. But even then, there was a struggle between fundamentalists, people who did want to put God in the Constitution. It was a hotly debated topic, with people like Patrick Henry, for instance, arguing for it. But we're fortunate that secularism prevailed, and people like Madison and Jefferson managed to create a secular constitution.
Will this go along with the Great Awakenings, where we meet a crisis in our history, and we do not know what to do about it, so we turn to religion and hoping that it will go away, and they seem to be points of crisis in our history. I know that at the turn of the century, the 20th century, 21st century, I assume the 19th century, that we have great awakenings sort of patterned on the century, that, and for those of us went through the 21st century change, there was all that buildup in 1999 that everything was going to collapse. All the technology was going to come unplugged. And at the end of the 19th century, you have the founding of all these various religious cults, millennial groups, that this is going to be the end of the age, this is it. And we turn to the irrational to explain things, to try to help us to cope with life. So that must have been a feed into this anti-intellectualism too.
Yes, and the interesting question is why America, why the United States? We are unique in the world among industrialized nations in being so religious and having these great awakenings. And Susan Jacoby posits at one point that not having a national religion, not having a religion that's inextricably intertwined with our government may be a reason, because once it is, people become more skeptical of it, and when citizenry and a particular religion are inseparable, then people will develop a healthy if not disregard, but questioning attitude towards both. And we haven't had that. And particularly with the size of this country in different rural areas, as she noted, when more energy and thought was taken to matters of survival, religion and fundamentalism flourished.
And literacy must also feed into this, because though we see this movement toward an educational system in the early 1800s to mid 1800s, and bringing the level of education up to a secondary level, we don't find that succeeds until probably in the 1950s, where you have now a majority of the population having a diploma from high school. There are very few people now that you encounter that have not had a diploma or at least a GED for high school equivalency.
Right.
But if you talk to your parents may be old enough. My parents are certainly old enough. They experienced that. They were both college educated, very rare. But the people that they associated with were people who had maybe 5th grade, 6th grade. Maybe they managed to make it all the way to 8th grade.
Right.
But they didn't go beyond that. And I wonder if that level of literacy contributed to the anti-intellectualism too.
Well, you can't discount historical events, and one of them, with the rise of education, was the GI Bill. The returning veterans from World War II were able to have their education paid for. And as she points out, that all of a sudden, when intellectualism was out of favor, particularly during the days of McCarthyism, suddenly there was this need for academics to teach these returning soldiers. And these people were able to secure jobs and to prosper. So that may have had an effect in promoting intellectualism on the one hand, but another thing, as part of our history, we've always had kind of a suspicion of the elite, which we still see as political rhetoric. And the regard for the person who pulled themselves up by the bootstraps and the self-made man, which is, that American story is a little counter to the intellectual, who is a person who lives for the mind. Right.
Yeah, the suspicion of intellectuals, I think, is quite interesting, and it does go back in our history. I'm still reflecting in terms of the 19th century how the development of the educational system is a northern enterprise rather than a southern enterprise. And I look at fundamentalism today, and it is a southern enterprise more than a northern enterprise. And that when we look at it, is getting less so because the South is becoming a different kind of political climate as well as a religious climate. But it's still predominantly it's called the Bible Belt. It's still primarily Bible Belt. Right. And there's something about the educational system that it runs through the South, that the jokes have been made about this over the years. It has been the brunt of these. It has been pointed out. And in her book, where she reflects back, that in fact the South did not develop the same kind of educational system that the North had.
One historical perspective she brings to it is quite interesting, which goes back much further, of course, to the French Revolution, when initially the tyrants are overthrown, but then it devolves into a very violent situation. And she claims that, and she's a very good historian, I would take her word on this, that one of the effects of the French Revolution was the uprising in Haiti of slaves, particularly, rising up against their masters. And the South maybe took a bit of a cue from this and thought upon reflection that, well, any religion is better than no religion because that will keep it from happening here. And they associated the French Revolution with the downfall of religion and felt that couldn't happen. We have to keep our schools more fundamentalist and keep that religious instruction. Otherwise, our whole economic system built on slavery could come crumbling down.
So it was, well, the South has been much more of an aristocratic society, especially in those days. And probably the slave trade helped to promote that we didn't have in the North. And the people that settled in the North seemed to be from a history of much more of the working class. They'd go out and find their own garden, so to speak. They didn't have slaves to do it. And that and then the value of the education. I look at least my grandparents from Norway, which came in at the end of the 19th century. The value of education was enormous for them, and learning English was a high priority.
Right.
This was literacy immediately, and although they had education back in Norway, they carried it over to this country, that it was a high priority, that this was a way of moving up for them. And so I think a lot of people, immigrants, especially in the northern tier, seem to have that value system.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it, because in the South, based on a more rural economy, a parent would consider, what does their child really need to know to take over the plantation, to work in an agricultural sector. So it may not have been as valued, and we certainly see a huge discrepancy even today.
Also, though the secondary education was very valued at the time, we also see this development of the university systems, which again were religious in base. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all of these were religiously oriented, and then they moved more secular as time went on.
Right. And I think it's inevitable given the advances in science. And in the next show we can talk about some of the effects, the deleterious effects of that. But when the basic sciences of geology, of biology particularly, of cosmology and the birth of the universe have become so glaringly apparent that those are not consistent with a literal interpretation of the Bible, if you're going to maintain your standing as a university, you have no choice but to diverge from those fundamentalist teachings, and I think that just has to be inevitable. Or there are attempts, Oral Roberts and other universities, to deny that, but I think on a world scale, as our world becomes smaller because of communications, you're going to be left behind if you insist on that fundamentalist interpretation.
Well, this first segment we have been talking about the history and a review of the book on Reason, looking at it in terms of the development of how education, how anti-intellectualism built in this country as a foundation. And as we move into the second segment, we want to reflect on how that has influenced us even more so in the modern day, right up to our present presidential elections, where we claim in the Constitution we have no religious test. The question is, do we? Well, I want to thank you for listening to Atheists Talk, and I want to thank Jack for being my cohort up here in the discussion of this book. Minnesota Atheists always welcome you as guests. We want to welcome you to our website, and it will be displayed on the screen. If you contact us, we will send you a free copy of our newsletter. If you would like, we would be interested in having you tell us what topics we should explore on this program. And I want to thank you again for listening. If you're interested in us, we're interested in you. Thank you.